Lab 4 has Republican members on it. Am I right? Is that correct?
Yes.
What input in this process did you receive from the Republican members of Lab 4?
I chatted with the Republican member of Lab 4.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if that was a casual chat in the hallway over coffee, or what specifically my question is asking is, what input on the process or on maps or the legislation that's before us today did you receive from Republican members of Lab 4?
Let me ask you that question, Mr. Walczyk. So I don't know if you've spoke to the Republican member of Lat 4 or your leadership, but Mr. Speaker, I don't know if there's another member of the minority to yield, but what input did your conference or members have in talking about communities of interest in their districts or anything related to that?
It's a great question, and I will yield, Mr. Speaker. I'm very clear on the process when it comes to the Independent Redistricting Commission. It was clear how input worked. We heard it from communities. We heard it throughout New York State. The Independent Redistricting Commission actually went out and sought the input, leaned into our constituency, asked them what they thought about different maps that they sent out, and received that input back, adjusted their plan. Republicans and Democrats, in a public way, had meetings that anyone in New York State could access. Well, they were fulfilling the role of New York State's Constitution and offered us a round of those maps. What I'm curious, if the sponsor would yield, Mr. Speaker, what I'm curious about is what input outside of the Constitution, when we've ignored the Independent Redistricting Commission, what input was received from the old process from Republican members of Lat 4?
Mr. Speaker, I love this, like, we ignored, and the implication being as if, like, the majority ignored. I mean, when I remember the vote not too long ago on this floor, I think there was a big bipartisan rejection of the maps that were presented before us. I don't have the maps in front of me, but there was, like, it needed 100, right? And it got 4 or 6, maybe 8 in some cases, 7. So if the word ignore is the proper word, which I'm not sure it is, I'm not sure it can be leveled from that your side of the aisle to my side of the aisle. It didn't work for the members who have their ability to press a button yes or no. But to try to answer your question, there were many data points to try to use to attempt to follow the constitutional principles. And some of those data points were in census data, right? Some of it were in all the testimony and things that happened in all those 24 public meetings. I'm sure your members have opinions as to the towns, communities of interest, villages, fire departments, school districts, major employers, or things like that that could make up communities of interest. So all those data points go into a holistic map. How exactly each individual member attempted to talk about their communities of interest or members of a public or your town or my town, I can't answer that question because it's a holistic process that gets us to a holistic map.
I can't answer that question. Would have sufficed. If the sponsor would yield, Mr. Speaker.
I'll yield, Mr. Speaker, but my answers are my answers, and the questioner's questions are his questions.
I realize that it's going to be difficult for me to deconstruct some of the process here on the floor, but maybe would you enlighten us as to what it will look like for the voters of New York State to learn about this process after the fact? When will we learn how Lat 4 functioned throughout the last few weeks or months or however long they've been meeting?
We talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I went into the entire process and how Lat 4 was a little bit different this year, and I'm using that term because it's really over 2 years, right? Like with the hearings and stuff. 10 years ago, or I certainly don't know 20 years ago, but I assume the same there, they conducted the hearings in that aspect. This time, IRC conducted those hearings, which created a robust record over many months.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Democratic conferences, do they take attendance?
Mr. Speaker, I've been in this conference, but I don't really know all the internal mechanisms of how people show up to conferences.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if the sponsor would just enlighten me, do they call your name off and ensure that you're in the room when they have a Democratic conference meeting?
Mr. Walczyk, how do you conduct your conference? I'll try to attempt to compare.
In the Republican conference, we generally take attendance. I'm just wondering if it's the same in the Democratic conference.
I'll try to get an answer for the questioner at some point, Mr. Speaker, as to who would have the answer as to whether or not they take a formal attendance or not. I don't know.
Mr. Speaker, I'll move on and I'll go on the bill. Thank you for your time. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I was wondering just how many Democratic members were assembled in conference room C on a particular day, because we're still at limited capacity in this chamber for members to be able to sit in their seats and participate in this debate. So it's an important question that I think we need to continue to ask. Mr. Speaker, the New York State Constitution requires us to receive maps from the Independent Redistricting Commission. In 2000, so the last time that we did this, there was a LAP4 process that had Republicans and Democrats involved and at the table. In 2014, because that process was so ugly with Republicans and Democrats that were partisan Albany politicians at the table, because that process was so ugly, they actually got together and said, let's not do this mess again. Let's pass a constitutional amendment, send it to the voters, and the voters in 2014 said, yeah, you're right, Albany politicians shouldn't be drawing the lines in this state. So they passed the amendment for the Independent Redistricting Commission. Here we are today. After in 2021, the majorities in the Senate and the Assembly sent a bill to the voters to try and go around that, just in case they didn't like the maps from the Independent Redistricting Commission. And guess what? They did it in 2014, and they said, no. No. Independent Redistricting Commission. The voters told us again. So here we are today. Now to show the most partisan and appalling, self-serving abomination of public service I have yet to witness in my term here. You're seeing the pinnacle of tyranny of the majority. This is exactly what de Tocqueville said we had to protect our Constitution against. And that's what New Yorkers sent us here to do. Government's important. The function of government is important. And the way that we do this process is important. We've got a very clear mandate from the New York State voter on how we should proceed. And that was completely ignored by the Democrat majorities, who can't even answer a question about what input was received from a Republican member. We love quotes. Here's one of my favorites. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., the Thomas Jefferson Memorial is one of my favorite spots. And he said, I have sworn on the altar of God eternal hostility over any form of tyranny in the minds of man. This is tyranny of the majority. Everyone at home knows it. Everyone in this chamber knows it. Everyone who has ever glanced at the Constitution knows this is tyranny of the majority. This is exactly the reason why, on the day that you're sworn in, you raise your right hand and swear to uphold the Constitution of the state of New York. This is the moment that you saying that actually matters. That's why I'm going to vote no, Mr. Speaker, because I stand before you today to honor that pledge, and I encourage all of my colleagues to do the same.